After landing for an historic and complicated trip to Israel, President Joe Biden pledged America's full, unwavering support for the country and announced billions of dollars in new aid. But he also cautioned Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu against unjust retaliation.
Justice must be done. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. The vast majority of Palestinians are not Hamas. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people.
More than 1,400 Israelis have been killed, mostly civilians who were murdered in the October 7th Hamas attack. And according to the UN, an estimated 4,200 people have been killed in Gaza, also mostly civilians, including many children, journalists, and medical staff. The first rule of just war is to avoid killing innocents. But beyond that, what are the laws of war, and how can they be applied and enforced in this conflict? To discuss, I'm joined by Father Brian Hare, former professor of religion and public life at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, who previously taught at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, and Tom Dannenbaum, an associate professor of international law and co-director of the Center for International Law and Governance at Tufts. So, Father, let me begin with you. What are the obligations that international law puts on combatants in this kind of a war?
Well, I'd like to frame it as what the moral obligations are, because my partner in dialogue will take you through the international law. So the moral theory about the use of force essentially argues that some uses of force by the state to protect its population and territory is legitimate. But the question of what kind of force, for what purpose, and by what methods then spin out from there. So, for example, if you take the moral argument about the use of force, that theory gives you the basis to condemn the attack by Hamas as morally, humanly, and legally wrong. But that theory is also going to judge how Israel responds to this attack. And as you said, at the heart of the argument about methods of the use of force, the directly intended killing of civilians is always wrong. Civilians may die in a legitimate attack, but the directly intended targeting of civilians is always wrong. And even if you are not targeting civilians, the argument is that the act can be unjust if it is disproportionate in terms of the damage that it does. So purpose, method, intention don't directly tend to kill civilians, always wrong, and use proportionate force to effectively suppress injustice.
So, Tom, if that's the moral standards, then law is how we try to codify those moral standards. So how does international law try to constrain this kind of warfare, and how is it enforced, if at all?
The first thing to say is that one of the key premises of international law on these issues is to separate two legal questions. One is the resort to force in the first place, essentially whether we're going to war, and the other is the conduct once we're in a war. And those two are not just separate, they're also independent from one another. So the rules governing how to fight are held completely independent from the cause for which either party is fighting, and apply to both equally, and apply to both even if the other violates. And some of the key principles are to distinguish between civilians and combatants, between civilian objects and military objectives, to direct all military operations exclusively at military objectives, to take feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm, and to not engage in an attack when the collateral damage would be disproportionate, which is to say excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And in terms of enforcement, one of the most obvious mechanisms in this context is the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction over any war crimes perpetrated on the territory of Palestine, as the International Criminal Court understands it, which clearly includes Gaza, and also any war crimes perpetrated by nationals of Palestine, which would include actions on Israeli territory by Palestinian nationals.
So there's a key point that both of you agree on, but I want to emphasize it because I don't hear it at all in the discussion. Which, if I understood you both correctly, what you're saying is it doesn't matter how provoked you are. That does not justify taking retaliatory or even less retaliatory actions that are in violation of the principles that you laid out.
It does not change the rules.
And there's really an overlap between law and morality, not identity if you play them out fully, but the overlap. And the overlap on the directly intended killing of civilians, I would say, is pretty much absolute. We are in the same place on that. But then the question becomes, once you have, quotes, ruled out the directly intended killing of civilians, is there anything left that is to govern it? Proportionality is one thing. Intention has something to do. By intention, I mean, what is the logic that drives the policy? And so if one sort of just classifies a whole area as a target area, and it's a mix of civilians and non-civilians, you've got the wrong intention. Your intention has got to be to deal with those who have provided harm. Hamas qualifies for that. There's no Hamas as its military force. Hamas itself is a fairly complex reality. It's a military force, a political reality, and a social reality, and so it's woven through the society. It provides a very significant challenge for Israel to do what it legitimately has a right to do, which is to seek to prevent anything like this from happening again. But doing that is not going to be simple.
Yeah, the law codifies some of those same principles. For example, the presence of combatants within a civilian population, where that population is on aggregate civilians, and clearly the population of Gaza as a whole is a civilian population, does not change the civilian character of that population. So any military operation that is targeted at the population as a whole, such as a total siege on that population, is an operation that is targeted at a civilian population and therefore implicates law of war violations.
So, but to push on this, right? So, if you were a member of the IDF and trying to think through this, what you'd say is we're fighting people who don't wear uniforms, who are mixed into a population that, 2.2 million people, it's about the same population density as New York City. That's what we're talking about. That essentially there is, I think if I were to think what they'd say there is no action we could take that would not harm civilians. So what would you counsel then they are allowed to do? What are the limits that they should be thinking about? And then,
well, I think the identification of Hamas as its military component is more and more trying to identify specifically, because it has provided a massive moral injustice that needs to be set right. So that's not wrong to seek to suppress that, both in the present and in the future. But it was interesting that Secretary Blinken's advice to them was, to Israel, you must win, but the question is how you win makes a difference. And what comes into play, not just for Israel, but for any state, is the question of legitimacy in the minds of people watching. I think it is important to indicate that the United States faced this problem and didn't face it very well in parts of World War II. Obliteration bombing in Europe, we had a perfect just cause to prevent the Nazi domination of Europe. We did not have a just cause to do obliteration bombing across the city, where you would have the mix of civilians and combatants joined tightly.
I would say two things. One is on that kind of attack, the law has developed significantly since World War II, and so where some of those attacks were at least open to legal question at that time, they would be very clearly unlawful today as indiscriminate attacks, or alternatively attacks on a civilian population, depending on the precise context. The second thing is, with respect to the difficulty of targeting Hamas fighters, that is obviously a complication that the IDF faces. At the same time, it's important to remember that the protections are for human beings. Those human beings here are, in the context of IDF attacks on Hamas targets, the civilians of Gaza. And what ought not be the case is that a violation by Hamas fighters, either of the prohibition on using human shields or on the prohibition of perfidious killing, where they're presenting as civilians in order to facilitate their activity, is a harm to the civilians of Gaza as well as a harm to the IDF. And the IDF should not be unrestrained from its obligations vis-à-vis those civilians simply because they have themselves, the civilians have themselves been a victim of the violation by Hamas of using human shields or otherwise endangering the civilian population. So the key thing is not to lose sight of the fact that the protections are for them and they're not the ones who are engaged in the violation to which this is a response.
I think a point to be made in this discussion is the journey from World War II until today. Civilians were targeted and killed on all sides in World War II, and it did not create a great uproar around that fact. The fact today that the targeting of civilians becomes a major issue in this very tragic conflict that is interesting in itself, that the general public understands this discourse, I think, in general terms, in a way that was not the case in World War II.
So how then, in a conflict in which, I mean, the initial blows, at least of this go-around, right, had no limitations about ethics or national law, I think I suspect the pushback President Biden got when he said you have to is that you're restraining us but not our enemies. What would you tell Benjamin Netanyahu if you had the chance to speak with him about why he should listen to what you just said?
Everybody thinks that their side is in the right. Everybody over-indexes on the violations of the adversary. And so to see violations by the adversary as a basis for acting without restraint and response is a path to total war on both sides.
Yeah, I think the question of legitimacy fits in here. And what I mean by legitimacy is not only legal legitimacy or moral legitimacy, but legitimacy in the mind of people who are trying to make sense out of this conflict. And what I would say to Mr. Netanyahu, if I had the chance, which I never will, is to say, keep in mind that not only the objective you seek is legitimate, but the way you do it can influence in the mind of a wider general public what's at stake. Now, we can't even talk to Hamas about that. There wouldn't be much sense in trying to talk to Hamas. So to some degree, it's an unequal burden that the Israelis face precisely because of what they profess and have professed for a long time, that they abide by these rules. He has to think not only about the objective, I think, but also the method and then the consequences as this is perceived in the wider international and national community.
Thank you. On that note, Brian, since you said I should, and Tom, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.